Thank you. How's the old book budget? Should I give a special announcement for you to pass on to your wives? Special dispensation. All right. So what I'd like to do, we'll see how this plan works. I've got a small raft of books here I want to commend, and I calculated I needed roughly 600 words per book, and I came in under that. So I'm gonna roar through all this, and if I have any time left over, I might go back and pick up some pieces. So here we go. My first book that I want to recommend to you is The Principles of War by Jim Wilson. So my father, Jim Wilson's my dad. My father was a graduate of the Naval Academy, and he studied at the Naval War College. After he got out of the Navy, in the 1960s, he wrote a series of articles applying the classic principles of war, as outlined by the likes of Sun Tzu and Clausewitz, to the realities of spiritual war. Right, so he took the principles of war, applied them to spiritual warfare. And I remember as a little boy going with him to the printer shop as he was first lining up the printing of the book. Principles would be things like mobility, surprise, or concentration. Methods would be things like arrows, rockets, aircraft carriers, or triremes. Pedestrian thinkers operate solely in terms of method. Strategic thinkers understand the value of principles. So there are some people who are just trained in a method, and that's what they do. And they don't understand anything beyond the outlines of that method. Strategic thinkers understand principles. Principles transfer from one setting to another, and from one generation to another. Principles transfer. Methods go out of date. Methods are replaced. So men who have learned how to think and operate in terms of principles are men who are much more capable of adjusting or adapting to new circumstances. But if you are trained in one method and you only have one script, and someone successfully gets you off that script, you do not know what to do. All right, so an evangelistic method would be something like the 4 spiritual laws. If someone's trained in that method and that's what they do, if someone dislodges them from the script, what do I do now? What do I say now? So, for one telling example of how this sort of thing applies, my father discusses the idea of the decisive point in any conflict. The decisive point in any conflict. That decisive point needs to be simultaneously strategic and feasible. Now, when it comes to all of our culture wars, New York City is strategic, but not feasible. New York City is strategic, but not feasible. If we took New York for Jesus, it would be all over, right? But that is not likely. But Beauville, Idaho, or Bend in the Road to the east here, is entirely feasible. We could do it in a couple of weekends. However long it took to unload the moving vans, but when we're all done, all we'd have is Beauville, which we did not need. It would not matter much to the big picture if we did that. So my father decided many decades ago, in the 1960s, that in the North American context, the decisive points to target were small towns that contained major universities. Small towns that contained major universities. The university made it important, and the small town made it feasible. Small town made it feasible, and the university made it important. And then, when he found out that Pullman, Washington, and Moscow, Idaho were 2 small towns, 8 miles apart, with a university in each one, he moved here. That's what happened. The name of the game is disproportionate impact. That's the name of the game, disproportionate impact. And you have to understand that everything that is now coming out of the Palouse is downstream from that strategic calculation. Everything. Why here? And I've encountered that question a number of times. Why the heck are you... Do you realize how hard it is to get to where you guys are? Also, incidentally, this is not to write off New York. If you're ministering there in New York City, God bless you, but you need to ask yourself there, what are the decisive points in this city? So what was happening is my father had zoomed out and was looking at North America. And he said, what are the decisive points in North America? That tells you how big a thinker he was. He zoomed out, was looking at the continent, and what are the decisive points? If God has given you a local ministry, zoom in and say, okay, what are the decisive points in my locale? Think strategically wherever you are. Think strategically wherever you are. I have no idea how many times I've read this little book, and its impact on my thinking has been seminal. I grew up in it. I grew up around it. I've heard my father speak on it, and I've read the book multiple times. It is a wonderful book. The second book, The Discarded Image by C.S. Lewis. One of the great problems of modern Christians living downstream from the Enlightenment as they do is that they've overwhelmingly adopted the general cosmology of the atheists, with a few carve-outs or exceptions to the general scheme. In other words, as Christians, they still have God up at the top, along with some angels up there, and down here with us, each of us have a human soul tucked away in our heart somewhere. But everything in between is just what Voltaire or Christopher Hitchens would say: flaming nebulae, empty space, and black asteroids. Just an endless concourse of atoms banging around. So you have God at the top and angels in this heaven that's in the 17th dimension somewhere, and then we mysteriously have a soul, but everything else runs mechanically in accordance with natural law, just like the atheist would claim. And that, I would argue, is a deficient cosmology. One of C.S. Lewis's objectives in his fiction, meaning the Ransom trilogy and the Narniad, was to reawaken the Christian sense of wonder with regard to the nature of the cosmos around us. He does this by taking us back to a description of the ancient medieval cosmology. He acknowledges at the conclusion of this book, the Discarded Image, that the cosmology had one fatal flaw, which was that it wasn't true. He grants this, but I think his generosity is only partial. I think this was a typical Lewis head fake. For example, in Out of the Silent Planet and Perelandra and That Hideous Strength, he preserves the essential elements of the medieval scheme while dispensing with some extraneous things. For example, each of the planets is overseen by an Oyarsa, an intelligent being responsible for that world, which is a medieval idea. But the spacecraft that first travels to Mars does not clonk into the crystalline sphere that was supposed to be there. So then, some elements are just gone, while others are very much alive and well. If you don't know the medieval cosmology, it's geocentric, the Earth is at the center, and then you have crystalline spheres and the moon is embedded in the sphere, and it spins, and then the next sphere out is, the moon, Venus maybe, I forget the order, but it goes out, and the whole thing is this artifact that's, and so the spaceship doesn't bonk into the sphere. So he's adapting to modern discoveries of the way the solar system works, but he preserves all the essential elements of the medieval cosmology. So, for example, in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, we have this exchange between Eustace and Ramandu. In our world, a star is a huge ball of flaming gas. Ramandu replies, "Even in your world, my son, that is not what a star is, but only what it is made of." Okay, now what Lewis is doing there is he's dismantling the materialist superstition. And Lewis was at war with the materialist superstition his entire Christian life. The Discarded Image is a scholarly and in-depth treatment of the cosmology that held sway over our civilization for much of its history. It is a dense book, but well worth the effort to get through it. If you want the broad outlines of Lewis's thinking here, but you don't have the time to handle such a book as The Discarded Image, there's an essay I can refer you to. In the book Studies in Medieval and Renaissance Literature, there's an essay called Imagination and Thought in the Middle Ages. And that is just a chapter-length treatment of the same subject matter that is found in The Discarded Image. So you can get it straight from Lewis. Number 3, Planet Narnia by Michael Ward. So the last Narnia book written and published, The Last Battle, was released in 1956. My father started reading the Narnia series to us when I was 5 years old in 1958. Okay, so I was introduced to Narnia 2 years after the last book was published. I think it's safe to say that I got into Narnia on the ground floor in 2 different ways. First, I was very young myself and wet clay susceptible. And secondly, the books were new to the entire world as well. In other words, the Narnia books weren't the Narnia books yet. They were just a recent publication. I've joked before that I grew up in Narnia and do not quite understand why they have not issued me the Narnian equivalent of a green card. Over the years, my father would read and reread the stories to us, and as I was the oldest of the 4, he would read us the first chapter, and then I would take the book and finish it that night. When the next reading time came around, I would be wondering why we couldn't move on to the next book. Now, I set this up in order to set up an expectation for you. When I first came to read Planet Narnia in 2008, I was flabbergasted. That was over half a century after I'd been introduced to Narnia. It was like growing up in a house that I knew inside and out, loving all of its nooks and crannies, only to have some visitor come over one day and ask about a light switch that I'd never noticed inside a cupboard door or something. When I flipped it to find out what it was, a staircase unfolded from the ceiling to reveal another floor entirely that I had never known about. One which contained a full-of-stock library with mahogany shelves and wonderful chairs and numerous literary treasures. It was like that. This Planet Narnia was that kind of experience for me. Ward's thesis, which he demonstrates conclusively, is that the 7 Narnia books are written in a way that maps onto the 7 heavenly spheres. Dawn Treader is the sun, the horse and his boy is Mercury, the magician's nephew is Venus, the silver chair is the moon, Prince Caspian is Mars, the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is Jupiter, and the last battle is Saturn. With this as a backdrop, numerous aspects of the books take on a new shape. Oh, ow. Tolkien had not liked the Narnia books because they seemed to him to be just a hodgepodge. Right? And Tolkien was a perfectionist. He would map out the walking of the people in the Lord of the Rings and make sure that it timed right with the phases of the moon. Right? He was that kind of writer. And he thought that Lewis just licked his pencil and sat down and... So, but there's plausibility to that supposition. Think about all the disparate elements that seem just jumbled in together in the Narnia stories. Who manufactured Mother Beaver's sewing machine? Where did she buy that thing? What's the beaver doing with a sewing machine? And what is Father Christmas doing in Narnia anyhow? Not Father Christmas? What's he doing? Greek fauns caper by us, and centaurs stand in the background, looking grim and stately. But what Tolkien assumed was the junk drawer of Lewis's mind actually had a deep and unifying structure, one that tied everything together in the most satisfying way. The result is what Ward calls Donegality, a word he reapplied from a comment that Lewis had made about County Donegal in Ireland. Lewis said that there's a certain Donegality to the place. And what makes Narnia work is the atmosphere of Narnia. And everything that Lewis is doing contributes to that atmosphere intelligently, and each book has a predominant atmosphere. Mars is the god of war, and Prince Caspian is the most military of all the books. Single combat, armies marching. Mars is also the god of forests and glades, and it's striking what role is played by the trees in that book. The trees come in at the end of the book to help win the victory, and they have to flee through the woods. They have to go. There's a lot of woods, right? In the silver chair, the moon oversees things like moonstruck lunacy, and really is under a heavy enchantment, out of his right mind for 23 hours a day. Because he's moonstruck. The color silver plays a role, as does wetness and wateriness, classically associated with the moon. And Ward just points out example after example. In the Dawn Treader, the sun is almost a main character. And this explains how it is that Father Christmas does too fit in wardrobe. Jupiter is the god of joviality. And by Jove is a common expression in that book. And who is more jovial than Father Christmas? He's there not because he fits historically. He's there because he contributes to the donegality of the book, which he does. So this is the book, Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, that actually put Ward onto the case. A line in Lewis's poem, The Planets, says, "Winter past and sin forgiven." And Ward was reading that poem, and he came to that line, "Winter past and sin forgiven." And it was, oh. And he jettisoned his PhD project and poured himself into this. So that about sums the book up. There's another book by Michael Ward entitled The Narnia Code, which is a more popular treatment of the same material. I read that one in 2013, and it was also stupendous. And so let me scooch that in as another recommended book. So, next book, Idols for Destruction by Herbert Schlossberg. I first read this book in 1983, and it was like swallowing an edifying cinder block. Schlossberg analyzes our contemporary world and begins by citing Hosea 8:4. They made idols for their own destruction. I have recommended the book to others ever since, and someone I recently recommended it to commented to me on how prescient it all was. So I read it back in the 80s. It was fairly new then, and he calls it, right? Because he thinks in terms of principles, not in terms of methods. Schlossberg identifies and he dissects 6 major idols. They are the idols of history, humanity, mammon, nature, power, and religion. He concludes with some commentary on what we should do about it all. In short, he covers the waterfront. If you are in the officer corps of the culture wars, if you're in any way responsible for leading others in cultural engagement, you must read this book. Right? It's not optional. You must read this book. Here are some quotes from Schlossberg. In a society in which idolatry runs rampant, a church that is not iconoclastic is a travesty. If it is not against the idols, it is with them. Here's another one. Big business often is said to be the enemy of government, but that is highly misleading. The robber barons were robbers because they bought off legislatures in order to further their economic interests at the expense of competitors and customers. Another one. The Bible can be interpreted as a string of God's triumphs disguised as disasters. And the preeminent example of that would be, of course, the crucifixion. Preeminent triumph. That's where God conquered the world. That's where Satan's kingdom was thrown down, cleverly camouflaged as a disaster. Here's another one. 2 more. Humanitarianism thus changes victimhood from accident to essence. It expands the category of victim until it swallows the entire person. It takes away the poor person's humanity and gives him in its place the ontological status of victim. The sheltering arms of humanist sentimentality shower altruism on the poor person and refuse to allow any criticism to fall on his behavior. Blame instead falls on circumstance. The universe is said to have arrayed its forces implacably against the victim, who understandably feels resentment and self-pity because of the fate that circumstance has arranged for him. He was born out of circumstance, molded by circumstance, determined by circumstance. That hard taskmaster will never release its hold on him, will always keep him in the thrall of ontological victimhood. There is no getting out. right? Once you adopt the posture of victim, you can get a lot of people to cater to you, but you also have locked yourself in a cage. And the gospel offers everyone a way out because Christ is the only true victim. Here's the last one. The paternal state not only feeds its children, but nurtures, educates, comforts, and disciplines them, providing all they need for their security. This appears to be a mildly insulting way to treat adults, but it is really a great crime because it transforms the state from being a gift of God, given to protect us against violence, into an idol. It supplies us with all blessings, and we look to it for all our needs. Once we sink to that level, as Lewis says, there is no point in telling state officials to mind their own business. Our whole lives are their business. And that's how we've gotten where we are today. Next book, I See Satan Fall Like Lightning by Rene Girard. One of the standard responses in our family whenever we see some form of mimetic rivalry erupt is to say, it's all in Girard, man. I want to give a caution, however, at the front end. Girard is one of the most insightful observers of human action and interaction that I know of, but he also exhibits the wisdom of the adage that when you buy a new hammer, everything you see looks like a nail. He takes his insight out to the utter frozen limit, which means that he ends in pacifism and a denial of the doctrine of the substitutionary atonement. He believes that the crucifixion is the hinge upon which all history turns, but he's more Abelardian than he is Anselmian in his view. He has to deny that it's not a true propitiation, but he still wants it to be central. So caution, as an evangelical, Reformed Protestant Christian, you can't go all the way with Girard. He was his own weird kind of Catholic, and you can't go all the way. But you can have some edifying conversations for a good 2/3 of the way. And you can learn an awful lot about what's going on. The problem arises in Girard's tendency to erase the need for the sacrifice of Christ on the cross to be a true propitiation. This means that at the end of the day, Girard believes that the crucifixion undoes the human tendency toward mimetic violence by Abelardian means, Christ as an example, rather than Anselmian means, Christ as a substitute. All right, that's my caution. Girard himself was aware of this tendency, and he somewhat jokingly tried to resist it in a presentation he once gave on the thought of Nietzsche, and he resisted that tendency unsuccessfully. But positively, at least on the topic of Nietzsche, he was quite correct. There are two kinds of desires. If you want to understand Girard, you have to understand there are two kinds of desires. One is creational, like the itch between your shoulder blades, or thirst, or hunger. Any of these things could happen to you on a desert island apart from all other people. But there's another class of desires that come to life because we are wired to everyone else. We are connected, all connected. These are mimetic desires, imitative desires. We want things as reflective and copying individuals, and because we lie to ourselves about what we are doing, we get ourselves into the most frightful snarls. Girard is great in his ability to enable you to see this kind of thing, and once you see it, you're going to be able to start seeing it in all kinds of situations. In springtime, this is a college town, in springtime, pastors find themselves talking to young men about young women. Do you think I should call her dad? I'm interested in Susie Q. Do you think I should call her dad? And generally, the young man has good taste, and abstractly, he should call her dad. If he's interested, the Girardian part of this is I can't tell you how many times I've had a conversation like that with a young man when I had a similar conversation with another young man the week before who's this guy's roommate about the same girl. And so two different guys and their desire for this girl is almost certainly not that creational kind of desire, like I'm thirsty and I want to drink water. It's mimetic, it's imitative. They live in the same community. They value the same sorts of things. They have the same kind of priority, and consequently, their interests, their desires converge on the same girl. And then what happens? Conflict happens. So I mentioned mimetic violence. So you have a toddler in the room, and he's playing with, let's say there's 20 toys on the floor, and you can only distinguish the toys by the serial number on the bottom, and it's very small print, and one toddler, preferably a boy, playing with one of the toys, and then you introduce into the room a second toddler, also a boy. There's 19 toys on the floor, and one in the other boy's hands. Now, where will conflict erupt? With the toy, because the kid who's just came into the room wants to play with the most valuable toy there. Well, how can I tell which one that is? Well, the one that is valued, the one that someone's playing with. And so he comes and reaches to grab it. And then the first boy, who was almost sick of the toy, was about to put it down, all of a sudden rediscovers the value of this toy, and he clutches it, and that's what happens, and thus we have human history. It is amazing. Gerard has got a lot of good things. So I see Satan fall like lightning as a good introduction to his thought in the context of New Testament. Next, Economics in One Lesson. Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt. As the proverb puts it, the road to hell really is paved with good intentions. Nowhere is this more evidently the case than when it comes to economics and economic proposals. There's a certain mentality afoot that measures every good deed in terms of what the expressed motives were, instead of evaluating each quote-unquote good deed in terms of what the actual consequences actually were. This slender book by Hazlitt walks us through any number of practical economic proposals, from tariffs to minimum wage laws, to full employment, to public works, to rent control, and so on, down the block and around the corner. He plainly and cogently shows why the solution to some public ill is frequently a solution that is going to be crying out for another solution later on. This is crucial in our time because numerous Christians want to apply the parable of the Good Samaritan to public policy, not realizing that competence on an individual level does not automatically translate to a society with millions of people in it. Suppose the Lord had told the parable about a Samaritan who did not know how to move someone who was badly injured and consequently broke his neck. Consequently made everything worse. There are people who don't understand that they don't understand first aid. And in the Lord's story, the Samaritan did understand first aid and did a good job. But there are people who make things worse. There are good Samaritans who are not really helping. So what happens if you have a country with famine and you just say, okay, let's drop everything and ship, and that country is ruled by an autocratic military dictator, and you ship a bunch of food to relieve the famine, what are you doing? You're feeding his army. You're feeding his army. You don't necessarily, your intentions don't fix things. It's intelligent biblical worldview thinking that's going to actually help. So Henry Hazlitt is not a Christian book, not explicitly Christian, but it's good thinking. And if you understand how human economies work, he's really going to help you out. So Economics in One Lesson. Next, Institutes of the Christian Religion by John Calvin. Many moons ago, before I was a Calvinist, I could feel the gravitational pull. I remember telling a friend, a Nazarene pastor, that if the Arminians were a grove of trees over here and the Calvinists a grove of trees over there, I would be a solitary tree over near the Calvinist grove. Unfortunately, theology doesn't work that way, and neither do systems of thought. But I still knew that I wanted to be nearer the Calvinists. I could feel the gravitational pull. Once I was on the road, during this era, I was on the road speaking in the Seattle area, or a little earlier than that era, and on my way home, I stopped in a Christian bookstore in Wenatchee, Washington. And I asked them if they had a copy of Calvin's Institutes because I was interested in obtaining a copy. And the friendly lady behind the counter said, "Oh, is that a new title?" Later on, I successfully obtained a set, and I began working my way through it. It was slow but rewarding going. I read through Calvin's Institutes the first time, not being a Calvinist, and then read through them again after becoming a Calvinist. And after I'd become a Calvinist, I read them again. And I'm not accustomed to quoting Karl Barth with appreciation, but I will here. Stay away from Barth. But Karl Barth was right about this. He said, Calvin is a cataract, a primeval forest, a demonic power, something directly down from Himalaya, absolutely Chinese, strange, mythological. I lack completely the means, the suction cups, even to assimilate this phenomenon, not to speak of presenting it adequately. What I receive is only a thin little stream, and what I can then give out again is only a yet thinner extract of this little stream. In other words, Barth considered himself overwhelmed by Calvin. There are depths there. Calvin is rich, rich, rich. And I would get acquainted with him in the Institutes. It was, we think of that as a book written for theologians. It was not written for theologians. It was written for rank and file Christians to equip them to learn the institutes of the Christian religion. It is a worthwhile book. That Hideous Strength by C.S. Lewis. I'm just checking I've got 3 more books. Wish me luck. That Hideous Strength by C.S. Lewis. So I'm smuggling 2 books into one review again here. This book should be read alongside The Abolition of Man. The 2 books were written at the same time, and in the preface, Lewis says this, in the preface of That Hideous Strength. This is a tall story about devilry, though it has behind it a serious point, which I've tried to make in my Abolition of Man. So I've read That Hideous Strength at least 16 times that I know of. It's not only the kind of book that I know I could read again, but it is the kind of book that after a certain period of time has elapsed, I know I will have to read again. It's that kind of book. I'll just, I don't have time to develop everything I have here. I'll just make a few comments. Mark and Jane Studdock are unhappy in their marriage, and this is because neither one has been willing to accept the station in life to which God has assigned them. Their respective sins in this regard drive much of the action in the book. Mark Studdock has been driven for much of his life by a lust to belong, and this makes him vulnerable to the lure of the complex systems driven by the inner ring, first at Bracton College and then at Belbury. This whole theme is developed by Lewis at length in an essay entitled The Inner Ring, and which can be found in his collection of essays called The Weight of Glory. Mark Studdock is the walking personification of this lust. Jane Studdock has the opposite problem. While Mark desperately wants to belong to the important set, Jane is fiercely opposed to belonging. She does not want to belong to her husband, which causes friction between them. And when she's forced to take refuge at St. Anne's, where the good guys are hiding, she is very resistant to the idea of submitting herself to that particular society. She wants independence. He wants to belong. And they both just irritate one another. Ransom tells Jane that her problem with her marriage is not what she supposes. He says, "You do not fail in obedience through lack of love, but have lost love because you never attempted obedience." Her conversion, and this is the wonderful turn in the book, her conversion occurs when she finally wonderfully submits. Mark's conversion occurs when he finally wonderfully rebels. They pass each other going opposite ways. He wants to belong and she wants to stay independent, and she surrenders and he surrenders. She surrenders by submitting, he surrenders by rebelling. Mark's transformation is described in anticipation as the moment when he would finally begin to be a person. That moment happens when he's being prepared by the objective room and he's told to show contempt to a crucifix. Lewis is very explicit in describing Mark's change as one of learning rebellion. When he's pressed, he finally replies, "It's all bloody nonsense and I'm damned if I do any such thing." So that's his moment of rebellion. That's his conversion. For Jane, it works the opposite way. She'd been in the grip of what Lewis describes as a prim little grasp on her own destiny. Ransom tells her that she needs to agree with her adversary quickly. She says, "You mean I shall have to become a Christian?" He replies, "It looks like it." And then when it happens, love swallows up her personal identity, but in a way that makes it possible for her to become Jane in truth. In this height and depth and breadth, the little idea of herself, which she had hitherto called me, dropped down and vanished, unflattering, into the bottomless distance, like a bird in a space without air. So, wonderful. I've got more I could say, but I won't. Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. I first read Tolkien when I was in high school at the urging of my mother. The framework of Middle-earth has accomplished in my mind one of the goals that Tolkien had set for it. The Mediterranean world had their mythologies, and the Norse world had theirs. In a strange twist, the English world did not have one. England did not have a mythology. And Tolkien set himself to rectify the problem. It is not a mythology in the classic sense, being handed down over generations, coming to us from the mists of antiquity. It was printed in a published and copyrighted book written by an Oxford Don, a man known to a number of people still alive. At the same time, if I might put it this way, it scratches a very similar itch to the one that mythology scratches. The Lord of the Rings is not an allegory. Through it, The Hobbit, Tolkien speaking in a letter here, The Hobbit is not an allegory, he says. The Narnia stories are not an allegory. So what is an allegory, and what are these stories then? Well, Tolkien recognizes the problem that we face. He said, "I dislike allegory, the conscious and intentional allegory. Yet any attempt to explain the purport of the myth or fairy tale must use allegorical language. And of course, the more life a story has, the more readily will it be susceptible to allegorical interpretations, while the better a deliberate allegory is made, the more nearly will it be acceptable just as a story." Anyway, all this stuff is mainly concerning with fall, mortality, and the machine. All right, that's Tolkien's summary. The fall, the flawed nature of man, mortality, and the machine. Tolkien's all the good guys. Basically, some people object to Lord of the Rings, some fundamentalist Christians, because it's got a wizard in it and, magic. But it's one of the most profoundly anti-magic books that can be imagined, because the most powerful instrument of magic, the ring of power, by providential circumstance comes into the hands of the good guys, and they resolve to destroy it, not to use it. Right? What they're doing is abjuring magic. They're rejecting magic. And virtually every one of the good guys is tested by the ring. And Galadriel passes on the ring. She passes the test. Faramir passes the test. Gandalf passes the test. Frodo fails at the test at the very end, but in a way that is still satisfying. Sam passes the test. Boromir fails the test, but then repents of that later. Who else? Elrond passes the test. Basically, all the good guys they have this failing in them that they're aware of, the fall. They're susceptible. They know they are. And the whole book is we reject that. We reject that. We reject that. We're rejecting the machine. Anyway, wonderful. Then last, Orthodoxy by G.K. Chesterton. I didn't start reading Chesterton until after I was out of the Navy. I came here to the University of Idaho and I decided to major in philosophy. I did this because my plan was to get my degree and then move to another small college town to man a bookstore after the pattern of my father's strategy, university in a college town, small town. The plan, in short, was to be an informal bookstore apologist/evangelist. That's what I was going to do. As an apologist, I wanted to be thoroughly acquainted with the other worldviews that were out there. I did not want to say to a Buddhist, for example, that his perspective was wrong because it began with a B instead of a C like Christianity does. In short, I wanted to understand what the other worldviews were, so I gave myself to study philosophy. The difficulty was that the study of philosophy meant being pitched headlong into a bunch of questions that I thought ought not to be asked. Or if they should have been asked, it should have been not pursued in the nonsensical way that they were pursued. I remember when I was doing my master's thesis in philosophy, I had to do a certain amount of reading in the journals it was on determinism and free will. And so I'd go up to the U of I library and I would sit at a table reading out loud to myself to maintain forward progress. These journal articles were like reading rapidly cooling magma that's flowed slowly across the page. And maybe it was my upbringing, whatever. Why are we talking about this? Why is this even an issue? So it was then, in my first year of studying philosophy, that I picked up my copy of Orthodoxy from our local Christian bookstore. It was like putting on an oxygen mask at 12,000 feet. It was like, oh, here's a man who luxuriates in the life of the mind. He was a thinker. He knew how to argue. He was a bracing thinker, but he knew how to think without abandoning common sense. And it was a lifeline for me. It was just wonderful. It was a life of the mind combined with common sense. Chesterton was bracing. He was exuberant. He was funny. He was insightful. He was a wordsmith. And then he was funny some more. Thanks. Thanks for coming.